And thus, when a political earthquake shakes its very foundations, it does what it does best. It tries to carry on. By early morning, the scene was set at the White House for the transition of power between two men whose differences have screamed across the airwaves night after night. Their language is dignified, conciliatory. But look, just look at the body language.
We now are going to want to do everything we can to help you succeed, because if you succeed, then the country succeeds.
I very much look forward to dealing with the president in the future, including counsel.
One a president who'd called the other unsuitable for high office and laughed at his prospects of winning. The other, a president-elect who for 8 years has questioned not only Obama's legitimacy to govern, but his very allegiance to the country itself. Trump began what they now call the birther movement, a political row in which some heard racial undertones, questioning whether the first black president was truly American.
If he has a birth certificate, he should release it.
So how do these two men put what they've said behind them, sit down and chat about the future? Trump will see in Obama a man so out of touch he never understood the working-class soul of the country he governed. Obama will see in Trump a man who's come to undo perhaps everything his last 8 years have tried to achieve. A lifetime ago, last November, I asked Donald Trump what he'd do in his first day in the White House. Now we're about to find out.
And what would you do on the first day in the White House? What would be your first act to change?
Many things. So many things you wouldn't even believe it. Thank you.
He's already hinted he'll limit the terms congressmen and women are allowed to serve, a shout out to those who felt Washington too institutionalized, too unready for change. Meanwhile, we're trying to guess who'll serve in his cabinet. Rudy Giuliani, the former New York mayor, a vocal Trump surrogate, and Chris Christie, the first senior Republican to endorse him, are expected to be well rewarded. Christie narrowly missed out on the top job as running mate.
Sure.
Did they get the wrong VP, sir?
No.
Let us remember tonight.
You're welcome.
No.
But he changed his mind?
I have no idea. You'd have to ask him.
Did he tell you about that? Did he call you after the...
I don't ever talk about my conversations with Donald.
Newt Gingrich, the former House Speaker, has been mooted as a potential Secretary of State. Ben Carson, one of the few Republican hopefuls for president to escape Trump's wrath, perhaps because he bowed out in time, can expect a meaty brief like health or education. And then there's the generals, Michael Flynn, who I caught up with at the Republican convention in July when I asked him about that wall.
I mean, what's the matter with building a wall? I just visited the Vatican. The Vatican has one of the highest walls around it. Why? Why does the Vatican have a wall around it?
Outside the White House, we found a few gentle drifters, protesters who claimed still that love trumps hate. One thing worth remembering is how quickly Americans of all political persuasions will begin to rally round their new president. They will defend the Constitution and all that that means. I've spoken to many over the past few days who were shocked and disbelieving, didn't vote for Trump, but are now preparing to give him a chance. Optimistic even about the change he could bring to their businesses and to their lives. The sun will set in Washington and it will rise again tomorrow. And thus the wheels of government and the robes of office will start to soften, perhaps blunt the edges of what just happened here in America and what it will mean for all of us the world over. Before they do, take a moment to repeat to yourself what you already know, but perhaps still can't quite believe. Donald Trump will become America's next president. Well, Mark Urban is in New York for us this evening. He's had his ear to the ground. And what are you hearing, Mark, about the way the Trump administration is shaping up now?
Well, they're doing this transition as quite fast as they can, from a slow start because they admit they weren't penciling names in the same way Hillary Clinton's people were. The key thing is the White House Chief of Staff. They're going to try and appoint that by the end of next week. It may take a little longer. And thereafter, those other senior cabinet appointments, drawing on the figures you mentioned, will begin. And of course, they've got a fairly limited pool of people because they fell out with much of the Republican establishment, the Trump camp. And a lot of people distance themselves. Well, some of them may be backpedaling now. But a key first appointment will be defense. Some people saying Senator Jeff Sessions might get that. That would be a way of building bridges into the Senate and the House, which I think we can also expect them to do in order to try and make the whole thing workable and, if you like, in party terms, harmonious.
And what is your sense, Mark, and we're just at the beginning of trying to work out the names involved, of how they will affect his policy and what agenda he can carry out?
Well, I was talking to a member of the transition team this afternoon about, well, which of these policies should we actually regard as being serious commitments? And the phrase that was used back to me was, oh, that was a campaign shtick, i.e. a sort of routine, and that none of it, in a sense, could be taken at face value. But I think if we look at what's been said over the last day or two, including by people like the Senate Majority Leader, Republican Senator, for example, reassuring NATO allies, look, this idea that NATO might be finished, just don't take any of that too literally. We've also heard messages, for example, directed from the Trump camp towards South Korea, Japan, similarly saying, look, the defense guarantees are good. Don't think what he said about, freeloading allies and maybe we should turn our back on all this on the campaign stump should be taken at face value. So that's all fascinating. Incidentally, also, Senate Majority Leader also pouring cold water on this idea of term limits, which you mentioned earlier. So there are signs that already quite a few things that were talked about on the stump may be jettisoned. So then you might say, well, OK, what are the deliverables? What are the quick things that can be done in order to show the country that he intends to honour some of those pledges? Then you come to attacking the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare. Big consensus in the House and Senate to back him on that. I think that's what we'll see early on. And of course, something of substance on the question of the famous Mexican wall.
Mark Urban, thanks very much. Well, joining us now here, Ron Christie, a Republican who worked for the Bush administration and for John Kasich too, and Mike Zinn, who was a spokesman for President Obama. It's lovely to have you both here.
Thanks for having us.
And Ron, those pictures of Donald Trump made him look and sound like a totally different candidate, a totally different man to the one we've seen on the campaign trail. I couldn't work out if that was fear, reality's now hitting him, or whether the whole thing was a bit of an act and he's not going to govern in the way he talked at all.
Emily, I can tell you, once you walk into the Oval Office for the first time, you're struck by the power of it, you're struck by the grandeur of it, and I think perhaps for the first time, Donald Trump looked today and said, my goodness, not only am I president-elect, but I'm going to be in this room for the next 4 or 8 years, and I need to pick up my game, I need to learn how to govern, I need to bring the country together, and today I think he got his first test of this is what you're going to be confronting.
He's never governed. Has he got credible people around him that will help him find the path to do so? What's his cabinet going to look like?
That would be very interesting. There's a lot of talk about Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York City, becoming his attorney general. There's talk about Dr. Ben Carson, who is also a candidate, being the Secretary of Education. But we're looking to see who are going to fill out those key positions. Who might be the Secretary of State? Who's going to be the Secretary of Defense? And most importantly, who's going to be the White House Chief of Staff? Of all the picks, the White House Chief of Staff is the most powerful and the most important one because they deal with feuds in the cabinet, in the president's cabinet.
And does he have the right caliber of people to go to?
Honestly, I don't know. There are a lot of people...
Don't know or don't think so?
Both. I can tell you, for having worked in the White House for 4 years for President Bush, there are a lot of people in Washington who are Republicans who are very standoffish with this incoming administration, want nothing to do with Donald Trump, want nothing to do with his policies. And the question remains, can he find people who are seasoned, who are veterans, who understand how to wield the levers of power, who can work with Donald Trump? And I think at this point, the answer, I still don't know.
Are you coming round? I mean,
No.
you've never.
I couldn't do that. I could not work for this president, for this administration. I think he will be working very efficiently and effectively with the Congress, but for my own personal integrity, for having worked with two gentlemen, Bush and Kasich, I don't have it in me to do it.
But the problem is Republicans have to decide now whether they step up to the plate. They say, this is what we've got, and he needs senior, strong voices and governance around him to help make it work, or do they see their role as one of keeping him in balance? I mean,
well, Emily, I think it has to work, right? I mean, this is the most powerful job.
If he fails in this job, it will also be, in part, the problem and the result of the Republican Party not rallying round, right?
Let me ask you this. Let me answer it this way. If I'm asked for my advice, of course I would give it. I mean, given the experience that I had for working for a president and a vice president and a governor, of course I would offer them counsel. But do I have it in me to go inside the gates of those 18 acres of the White House behind me? Not at this point.
John Kasich was originally approached. You worked closely with him. He was approached for the vice presidency.
He was.
He said no.
He said no. Well, John Kasich comes from this from the same viewpoint and standpoint that I do. It's, do you believe that this person is fit to be president of the United States? Do you believe this person has the intellectual capacity and the curiosity to be president? And Kasich didn't feel that way. And I feel the same way. Now, is he a brilliant man? Yes, he's a brilliant man. He's a billionaire. He's a very successful businessman. The question remains, can he parlay those skill sets into governing when he's never done it before?
Will he be able to fill the office, or should he fill the office, with the private sector? We've heard all this talk of oil and gas executives, maybe banking execs like Jamie Dimon. Is that the way this cabinet's going to go? It's going to look like a board.
Sure. I mean, when we first came in the Bush administration, we took someone from Wall Street, John Soh, to become our first Treasury Secretary. I think it's a smart move. It would calm the markets on Wall Street. They'd say it's one of our own. He knows what he's doing, knows what he's talking about. I've heard the rumor about Jamie Dimon as well from Goldman Sachs, and my understanding is he said he's not interested.
Mike Zinn, I couldn't get over those pictures of President Obama's face today, and he said all the right things, and he had the language, but he looked shattered by what he was having to do.
Yeah, it was obviously a very frank conversation about what faces them now. I think right now you have basically things in two buckets. You have the transition where everyone, all Americans, want things to go well, and then you have the emergence of a loyal opposition starting to see what he's going to do. I mean, Donald Trump on the campaign trail and now as president-elect has had no problem reversing course in a matter of seconds on major policy decisions. So it's really an unknown how he's actually going to govern. And I think he needs to start making that case and start telling the American people and the world how he's actually going to govern.
But in terms of the mechanics of transition, what actually goes on now?
I mean, everything that would happen when you start a new job, or you have one of the largest companies in the world, and you have most of the middle managers and managers switching overnight. So everything from finding your computer and getting your car parked to working on Obamacare and affordable care and health care for 8 years and implementing it, to the next day trying to dismantle it. So you're doing everything from changing the policies to trying to figure out how to actually get into your office.
Do you think Democrats will come on board? I mean, what I'm trying to work out is, do those who have bad-mouthed Trump and hate Trump still feel a patriotism comes first? Everyone jokes about Donald Trump being more of a Democrat at heart than a Republican. So if he called on them, would they serve in his administration?
I think people will want to look for ways to work with the administration. One thing that there's a lot of talk on the Hill about right now is an infrastructure bill. There is the possibility of moving something that Democrats have wanted to move, congressional Republicans have not. Trump wants to invest in infrastructure. There might be an opportunity to pass something big and meaningful in the first 100 days. Could that change Donald Trump's disposition to working with Democrats? It could. I mean, you want to be hopeful, but right now when he hasn't made any cabinet picks, he hasn't announced his chief of staff yet.
What do you think he's going to repeal? I mean, I talked about Obama must just look now at his legacy and see it all being about to be wiped out, whether it's Obamacare, whether it's the Iran deal, the Cuba deal.
Immigration.
So what do you think Donald Trump will do first? I mean, do you think, what should he do first?
Well, today he said he was very, to your point, he said he was very interested in trying to figure out a way to work with Congress on infrastructure. I think there's bipartisan consensus on that. If Donald Trump comes out in the first 100 days...
Infrastructure being the wall.
No. Infrastructure meaning roads and bridges and whatnot. But if he finds a way to do criminal justice reform, that's something that Republicans and Democrats have agreed on. If he does those sorts of things in the first 100 days, I think the media and the Democrats will warm up to him and say, okay, he's a little bit more reasonable.
Does Obama throw his hands up now and say there's nothing I can do to protect what I've done, or are there checks and balances that he can put in place to keep the stuff that he wants to hold on to?
I think he'll, in the coming days, they'll try to finalize regulations that they've been working on. Things don't happen overnight, despite what Trump may think. There are big decisions on the Affordable Care Act. 20 million people have health care that didn't have health care 8 years ago. How you, even under best case scenario, how you wind that down with the best of intentions could be cataclysmic for the economy and for 20 million people. So there's a lot of work to do in how they do that. It doesn't go away on its own.
Thank you both very much. Thanks for coming in. We will be back later in the programme asking how all the polling screwed up so badly yet again. Now, back to James in London.
Thank you, Emily. So what will it all mean for the so-called special relationship? Will that infamous wall be accompanied by a metaphorical bridge across the Atlantic? Trump's late mother, Mary Ann, emigrated to America from the Scottish Isle of Lewis with just $50 to her name. And he has previously professed great affection for her homeland, albeit mostly while trying to convince her erstwhile compatriots to let him build a golf course. Today, however, eyebrows were raised in diplomatic circles when he telephoned Theresa May only after speaking to the leaders of 9 other countries, including Ireland, Australia and South Korea. Newsnight's political editor Nick Watt has been taking a closer look at what the future might hold. But first, he has some interesting developments that have emerged today. Nick, what's been going on?
Well, there's an intriguing story on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. Farage to be Trump go-between. Now, the newspaper's main UKIP watcher, Christopher Hope, is reporting that Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary, has decided that he's going to have a chat with Nigel Farage before he starts talking to the Trump team. Now, Downing Street are playing this down, saying there are no scheduled conversations between Nigel Farage and Liam Fox. But I think we should take this seriously. And the reason for that is that Liam Fox has the best contacts of anyone at Westminster with established Republicans, but Donald Trump is not an established Republican. He's never met him and he doesn't really know the Trump team. But Liam Fox does know Nigel Farage, and it wouldn't surprise me. They have a very friendly, informal relationship. They text, they see each other at parties. It wouldn't surprise me if they have a bit of an informal chat before Liam Fox makes contact with the Trump team. But you were saying there was that call today between, as they say in the United States, the principals, Theresa May and Donald Trump. She obviously had to wait a bit to have the call, and that obviously revived all that talk about the special relationship. So we thought we'd take a look at what the election of Donald Trump means for the UK.
It had to be you.
A new special relationship.
It had to be you.
The word special is perhaps not the most appropriate word to describe it.
A truly special relationship.
An absolutely essential relationship.
The special relationship. It's so special that every time there's a new one of these, we have a mini crisis to make sure we are still loved. Panic over. Theresa May wasn't exactly first in the queue, but when the Donald eventually picked up the phone, he reaffirmed his commitment to our special relationship and even described the UK as a very, very special place for me and our country. It's no great secret that ministers had hoped and assumed in private that Hillary Clinton would be elected president. During the campaign, there were concerns about Donald Trump's volatility and his commitment to the NATO security umbrella. One cabinet minister even told me recently that a Trump victory would mean the world would be run by 2 madmen, the Donald and Vladimir Putin.
This is going to be Brexit plus. Brexit plus.
But Newsnight understands there's now a feeling in Downing Street that there may be an upside. There'll be a Brexit-supporting US president, raising the prospect that EU countries thinking of punishing the UK will have pause for thought. Theresa May is also hoping that Donald Trump's victory may prompt a rethink amongst Remain supporters who thought that EU referendum was an aberration that could be overturned. One former Tory leader believes critics should look at the plus side.
You can, if you like, go out into a corner, scream and shout, burn flags and carp like mad and say, oh, you know, woe is me, this is a disaster. Or you can look and ask yourself the question, what's the role for the UK? And I think the interesting thing about Donald Trump is he is well disposed towards the UK. We've had a very poor special relationship with President Obama. It's pretty much been in the freezer now for about 8 years. I think this is a real opportunity with Donald Trump there for us to be able to reinvigorate that relationship.
A former British ambassador to Washington agrees with number 10 that Donald Trump may turn out to be a helpful ally during the Brexit negotiations.
If any European country or member of the Commission or head of the Commission wants to punish us, the knowledge, not only that it might upset the US President and the US administration, but the knowledge that we will soon be able to have a bilateral trade agreement with America may concentrate minds wonderfully in the deep bowels of the European Commission.
So the atmosphere is all very different now. We've gone from this...
The UK is going to be in the back of the queue.
...to thinking that we may now be at the front of the queue. though that may come with a fly in the ointment.
We may go to the front of the queue because I think the agreement that's being negotiated between America and the European Union is going down the tubes anyway. But it is not in our interests, I think, that anything should happen which will actually damage global trading relationships, which could contribute to a recession in a whole series of countries, just as we are trying to drag ourselves out of the last economic crisis. So if he does strike down the North American Free Trade Agreement, if he does refuse to ratify the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if he does start a trade war with China with 45% tariffs on Chinese imports, we would regard that as damaging, I think, to our interests.
There may be some uncertainty as a new world order emerges, but Ian Duncan Smith believes the guardians of the special relationship are ahead of the curve.
There is a wind of change that is blowing now through Western capitals. This is not just about Brexit. This is about the sense that people who have not been listened to for years and years and years are now saying, I've had enough. I want to be listened to. We want to have accountable government.
It had to be you.
In the new year, Theresa May will head to Washington to meet the new president. As some of her predecessors know all too well, the special relationship comes with a health warning. It can end up defining a premiership.
Well, one man who has already had his own one-to-one with the US president is the former Labour leader Ed Miliband. He met Barack Obama at the White House back in 2014 when it still looked possible that he might lead his party to victory here. Today, things looked rather different as he described the president-elect as a racist misogynist. And he joins me now. And that, right there, Ed Miliband, is perhaps what a lot of people watching will perceive as part of the problem. Donald Trump stands up and expresses scepticism about the scale of immigration, makes promises to people who worry that their country is being in some way overrun and swamped. And they would say people like you reach immediately for the racist.
No, he said Mexicans were rapists, and he confessed to being a groper.
He did add that he was sure there were some good Mexicans as well.
Oh, right, OK, some of his best friends. Look, I think we've got to understand the scale of what Donald Trump's victory means. I actually agreed with what Ian Duncan Smith said at the end of that film, which is that this is a huge vote against politics as usual, against economics as usual, I think. You know, the very fact that people, we know from the exit polls, knew all these terrible things about him. They didn't like them, actually, many of them, but they still voted for him in large numbers because he represented change. And they thought, you know, I want some kind of change. So, look, it's a very significant result. It has deep implications for us and deep implications for our politics.
And you, I mean, I had a similar experience, I suppose, with Brexit, your own constituency voting overwhelmingly to leave while you were a prominent campaigner to remain. Are we, or are you, in any position to sort of lecture American politicians on failing to listen to ordinary people?
I'm not lecturing. I want to learn the lessons, and I want to learn the lessons of Brexit as well. Look, Brexit does mean Brexit. I agree with Theresa May on that. We are going to leave the European Union. We've got to shape that settlement so that it doesn't damage my constituents. That's one of my responsibilities. But the other thing we've got to do, and to be fair, she did recognise this when she became Prime Minister, although she hasn't done much about it, is what happens outside those negotiations is as important. Are we going to change the inequality we see in our country? Are we going to do something about people in low-paid jobs who don't feel they're going anywhere, haven't had a pay rise? Are we going to actually make a difference to communities that feel they have been left behind and haven't had the investment? So look, I think there are definitely profound lessons, and I think, look, in a generally situation I didn't want to see, either Trump or Brexit, I think that the lesson for the centre-left is that we have to step up to this challenge. We've got to recognise what people are saying and respond to it.
So it's career politicians who have to learn the language of people who despise career politicians.
Well, look, do we need people who've got from different backgrounds? Yes, absolutely we do. But if I can put it this way, Bernie Sanders is a career politician. Now, I'm not saying he would have won the election, because I'm certainly in no position to say who would have won an election or lost one. But he certainly represented anti-politics and political change. He's been in politics all his life. Jeremy Corbyn, actually, has been a career politician, but I don't think people see him as part of the political establishment. So, yes, Do you own the failure of the political system, or do you want to change it? That is definitely a litmus
It's that
test.
profound for you, is it? The failure of the existing political system?
Look, it absolutely is profound. People think politics hasn't listened to them, and people think that they've been stuck and well, in America anyway, certainly, a large proportion of people, and in Britain, to be fair, think, you know, I don't feel like my economic situation has improved. I've been left behind. That's why, in a way that many people will have noticed, the establishment supporting Brexit and the establishment supporting Trump was, in a sense, a calling card for people to vote the opposite way, and I definitely accept that. And
the leader of the Labour Party should surely have done quite a few of these things while in situ.
Me?
Yes.
Sure. Look, I didn't win the election.
But why didn't you get that message across more to people who felt that...
I think there's a number of things. I would say I was sort of too radical for the people who wanted reassurance and too reassuring for the people who wanted radicalism.
It's a soundbite, isn't it?
No, I think it's true. I think there were some people who wanted reassurance and they didn't feel they didn't trust us. And there were some people who wanted more radicalism and bigger solutions. If there's a lesson I learned, it's the solutions need to be bigger. And you need to embrace political change and be representatives of political change.
And you also, to look at the parallels on both sides of the Atlantic, you also somehow need to undertake a redistribution of wealth. This is the strange thing, perhaps, about Donald Trump being perceived as right-wing. He has made people believe that those who've got loads will have a bit less, and those who don't feel they've got enough will have a bit more. Can you do that in Western politics, given the vested interests of the big companies and the lobbyists, more so in America than here? Can you get a message out there that you're actually going to spank the rich in a way that Donald Trump has implied he's going to do, but his tax proposals suggest he may struggle?
Well, I certainly don't think he's going to do it. But if what you're saying is there needs to be a big redistribution of wealth and income, absolutely. Is that a message that you can get across? I think it is a message that you can get across. I was always surprised when, for example, I announced my energy price freeze, took on the energy companies. Lots of people said, oh, well, it's going to be deeply unpopular. Now, it didn't win us the election, I accept that. But I think people were ahead of us, actually, in truth. I think the public was ahead of us. But, you know, I think now the opportunity is for the Labour Party to, you know, seize this moment. And I think, you know, that's obviously what Jeremy Corbyn is going to try and do.
He's keeping his head down, though.
Well, I think, to be fair, I don't think he's exactly keeping his head down. I mean, I think his statement after Trump's victory was absolutely right and bang on about the problems of what he saw in Trump's campaign. I actually think it reflected more what Angela Merkel had said rather than what Theresa May said. I think one of the things that's important is that actually we do stand up in our relationship with Donald Trump, yes, for our interests, but also for our values. And where he contravenes those values, we should say so loud and clear.
Ed Miliband, many thanks indeed. Now, Hillary Clinton was, of course, counting on the black vote, and in percentage terms at least, she got it. The total number of people of colour who voted, however, seems to have fallen well short of what she both expected and needed to win the presidential contest. Arguments over what caused this will rage until the next election, and quite possibly beyond. And in a moment, we'll probably start a couple with the philosopher and civil rights activist Cornel West. First, though, we spoke to a number of African-American women about their reactions to a President Trump. Nafisa Dodi is one of many who are worried.
I'm concerned not only for myself, but I'm concerned for, you know, my mother and sister who live in North Carolina. I have friends texting me this week saying, I'm nervous I'm going to be gay bashed or told to go back home. I'm going to get emotional. There are a lot of people who have ignored and avoided and denied the division that is so deep in this country. And it's something that I think at this point we all have to come to terms with.
And now to Dr. West, who backed the Green candidate Jill Stein for president. I spoke to him earlier and began by asking whether he now regretted not endorsing Hillary Clinton.
No, I think I have even more animus against the Democratic Party that would trot out a neoliberal disaster, knowing that we needed a Bernie Sanders-like figure who could convince the white working class and then link them to poor people, people of color, women, gays and lesbians, disabled and elderly and others. And so, no, not at all. I think even if Hillary Clinton had won, I would be still deeply concerned about her militarism in the Middle East and Russia and so forth.
Are you at all encouraged by the apparent cordiality between President-elect Trump and President Obama at their meeting today? 90 minutes with nobody else present and both speaking in surprisingly warm tones afterwards.
Well, I mean, we know that the elite, no matter whether they're neoliberal, conservative, and sometimes even neo-fascist, they have a certain common culture. They went to the Ivy Leagues, they hang out at the same golf courses, they sip tea in the same context. So in that situation, both of them are masters at putting on a certain kind of mask in order to connect with each other. But most importantly, I'm very concerned about the Planned Parenthood sites. I'm very concerned about what's going to happen to my Muslim and Mexican brothers and sisters now. And we know that, Obama himself deported over millions of people, so there's a certain continuity even on that issue with both of them.
You've contended in the past quite persuasively that Barack Obama was perhaps too keen to prove himself a president for all people, and that may have actually dissuaded him from taking more profound action specifically in favor of the African American community. Could that be part of the reason why so many black voters appear to have deserted the Democrats between 2012 and 2016?
No, my argument was that his language was he's for all the people, but his neoliberal administration has not been for poor and working people. That's why you got the resentment. That's why you got the right-wing populist backlash supporting Trump. The recovery during the Obama administration never really filtered down to poor people or working people.
Indeed, but it has been cyclical, some suggest, that whenever there is a big step forward for civil rights, the pendulum inevitably swings back a little. Do you think having a man of colour in the White House for 8 years did create a groundswell of resentment that Donald Trump was able to exacerbate?
I think that's true. I think that's one element of it, but we don't want to accent simply the racial element and downplay the class element. If we had a black man in the White House who focused on working people, no matter what color, and focused on poor people, it would pull the rug from under any possible Donald Trump.
Could he have done that, though, with so little support in the Congress and the Senate?
I'm talking about the motivations and the efforts. If he had tried to do it, then he would have showed white working class men and others that I'm concerned about you, I just can't pull it off. But by not even trying to do it, they had no alternative. Most Americans are desperate, my brother.
Briefly, Dr. West, do you think Brother Bernie could have beaten Donald Trump?
Yeah, I do.
And finally,
very much so.
Finally, do you fear for your country's future at the moment?
I have always feared for the future of America because every democratic experiment is very fragile, and I come from a people who've been enslaved, Jim Crow, hated, lynched, but we never lost our spirit. We never lost our willingness to love, to laugh, to live, and to embrace others. So yes, I have deep fear for the future of this democratic experiment. The American empire is in deep crisis. The aim is, how do you revitalize it? And you revitalize it by remaining true to the truth-telling and the witness-bearing for justice that has kept American democracy alive, though oftentimes in very, very difficult times, including bleak moments like today.
Cornel West, many thanks indeed.
Thank you so much, Brother James. Take good care, man.
I should probably warn you now that there's an impressive body of evidence suggesting that you may currently be watching an endangered species of news programme. The so-called mainstream media, where facts are checked and stories properly sourced, has taken one hell of a beating after barely any of it elected to endorse Donald Trump, and significant swathes did precisely the opposite. Facebook, Twitter and websites which proudly wear their biases on their sleeves, meanwhile, are on the march. Newsnight's David Grossman has been keeping step with their impact on that US election.
The US media's reputation went up in flames with Donald Trump's victory. The almost universal opinion, based on polling and other evidence, was that he wouldn't win and couldn't win.
I know of no one who really got it right, no one who really saw this coming. We were all in it together. We all got it wrong.
Not only that, a majority of titles said he shouldn't win. Hillary Clinton received the endorsement of 229 daily and 131 weekly publications. In contrast, Donald Trump just received the endorsement of 9 daily and 4 weekly publications. No previous candidate could have sustained that level of media hostility from the traditional media and gone on to triumph.
If you want an example, think what he said about the Pope. For a couple of days, Trump blasted the Pope. Now, if Jeb Bush, say, for instance, had said even half those things, we would all now be saying, well, look, Jeb could probably have been president, but why on earth did he say that stuff about the Pope? And Trump just had the ability, which is rare in some ways, to convince people that he would sound off about this and then sound off about that, and he wasn't judged by the same standards as other people, and that's interesting.
But newspapers are the past. 62% of Americans now get their news from social media, predominantly Facebook, and many of them don't see any other news sources at all. Just 15% of Facebook users also engage with print media, just 23% with the network nightly news bulletins. It's true that some of what people see on Facebook may have originated from a traditional newspaper or TV program, but increasingly it's not. Facebook selects what to show you, not based on whether it's from a reputable source or an important story, but whether it thinks that you'll be interested in it, whether it's been shared by people you know. And what people share may be, and often is, partial, incomplete, or sometimes downright fake.
Stories about how Hillary Clinton is a Satan worshiper, and stories about how the Pope has endorsed Donald Trump. And because people who already connect with Donald Trump connect with these stories, they share them in very large numbers. That story I mentioned about Donald Trump being endorsed by Pope Francis, a false story, was shared over 800,000 times on Facebook.
What's sometimes not appreciated in the UK is how big a star Donald Trump was before he went into politics. His show The Apprentice took over the slot vacated by Friends, and before that, Frasier. He was getting primetime audiences of 30 million.
I get bigger crowds than they do. It's true. I get far bigger crowds.
He used his profile to build a massive social media following. On Twitter, his followers rapidly outgrew Hillary Clinton's. It's estimated that his campaign only had to spend half as much per vote as hers. Another factor is how geographically remote the traditional media has become from many American voters.
As the newspaper business in the United States and in other countries has been in decline, and we've moved from print to digital, what we've really seen is a media industry that is shifting from being relatively evenly distributed geographically across the country to it being very focused and centered in New York and DC and maybe a few other cities. So I think there's an argument to be made that the distance between the average Trump voter, who probably doesn't live in New York or Washington or a major city, and the media that is being produced by traditional outlets, there's a gap there. And I think what filled that gap was social media. And most of all,
big traditional media outlets now have a huge challenge in front of them, not only to attempt to reconnect with huge numbers of Americans who mistrust them, but also, after how wrong many called this election, to show that they're worth listening to.
And in New York to discuss this with us is a paid-up member of the mainstream media, Jacob Weisberg, the editor-in-chief of the Slate Media Group. And I'll begin, Jacob, if I may, by asking you to define mainstream media. First of all, what you think it means in common parlance, and then perhaps what it means to you.
Well, in the United States, it's the media that has strived to be neutral, objective. It would include the New York Times, the Washington Post, and in the old days, the three major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC. There are others as well, the AP, the UPI, the news wires, but that would have been the core group in the old days.
And the accusation, of course, from people who have lost faith in the mainstream media is that all of those institutions are biased.
Well, look, that's been an accusation going back to at least the Nixon years, which regarded many of those news organizations as opposed to him. It didn't stop them from trying to be fair, just as I don't think Donald Trump's accusations have stopped them from trying to play their role. But it is difficult when now the President of the United States treats journalism that attempts to be objective as opposition. Does it push them into the role of being dissident or opposition media? I think to some extent it probably does.
And yet there is a danger, probably a fear already, that the people who perhaps need persuading will not be consulting the traditional media. In fact, as David Grossman's film suggested, we can create our own news now. We can create a beautiful reflection of our own thoughts and preconceptions and not have any of them challenged by traditional journalism.
I think that's what really changed this time. You know, the alt-right has an alt-media, and this phenomenon has been described as a filter bubble, where if you get your news on Facebook, you only see things that you agree with. And in fact, much of it may be disinformation, propaganda. I mean, not just biased news, but truly false news, stories about Obama's Kenyan birth certificate or Hillary Clinton's Satanism. And on Facebook, a story from the New York Times looks much like a story from Breitbart or the National Enquirer, or propaganda manufactured by the pound in Macedonia. So it's a deep problem, but I think there are people who not only don't use mainstream media, but get their information in ways that are invisible to the rest of us and are wholly dishonest.
Do the tech giants have any responsibility? Do the social media companies have any responsibility to start regulating this in just a simple question of provable truth in a more responsible fashion?
Look, I think they do. I think Facebook in particular has been very reluctant to accept any responsibility for being a news organization, but it is the #1 distributor of news on the planet. And if Facebook's stance is essentially that we are not going to arbitrate between what's true and what's fictional, and that anyone can have any kind of news they want, they're going to contribute to this problem, not just in the United States, but globally. We can survive in a world where we have very different opinions, but I don't know that we can survive in a world where we all choose our own facts.
We will see. Jacob Weitzman, many thanks indeed for your time. And that's all from us in London tonight. Now, back to you in Washington, Emily.
Thanks, James. The media, the political establishment, the vested interests and those dreaded elites, most stalwarts of the status quo, have been at best embarrassed and at worst fatally wounded by the Trump phenomenon. And while talk of a surge may be misleading, he secured fewer votes overall than both the Republican candidate Mitt Romney in 2012 and his rival Hillary Clinton. The failure of pollsters to call things correctly has come in for particular criticism. Do they deserve all of it? Joining me now, the Democratic pollster Stan Greenberg. It's lovely to have you here, Stan.
Thank you.
And the narrative that's been written is, oh, the polls got it all wrong again. Is that right?
It is certainly right that they've got it wrong again, just like with Brexit, just as in the general election in Britain, just as in Israel. But I do think the origin of the problem lies in what's happening to democracy, the kind of disengagement of some voters, but the engagement and frustration and populist and often protest vote that leads to big increases in turnout with some voters and decreases with others.
I mean, this is what Kellyanne Conway, Trump's campaign manager, was saying, and nobody knew if it was puff or not. She said there were undercover Trump voters, that they had the data, they had the lists. They did.
Yeah, I don't believe that.
You don't believe it?
No, I don't believe they're shy Tories, or shy, Trump voters. And just as we looked at Great Britain, if we looked at what happened in the general election and why the polls were so wrong, not Brexit, why it was wrong in the general election and where Labour stood and where the Tories stood,
right.
was, if the academics, their conclusion is it's almost totally about turnout and age. Young voters, reported they were going to vote and vote Labour, didn't vote or voted much fewer numbers. The older you are, and pensioners, they voted in very large numbers and for the Tories. And so turnout, the real turnout, rather than the reported, desired turnout, turned out to be the main factor.
But is it also the disconnection? I mean, when you talk about academics, the response of the Trump voter was, you didn't come to find us. All the polling is skewed towards a sort of urban and metropolitan vote. You didn't go after the farmers in Iowa and actually find out what they were going to do.
Yeah, look, what I do think is there's a phenomenon where the Trump voters were very much in rural areas and small town, white working class communities that impacted the Rust Belt in particular, and enabled him to win these states
right.
and become the president. And I do think being in those communities reinforces where you are. And by the way, we did have very big margins in our polling, in all of the polls, for Trump with those voters. The margin just got bigger, and it was mainly with the men. What happened at the end was that the women who were listening to the gender issues, who had responded to Hillary earlier, at the end of after the debates, after a whole range of other issues,